Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we move on to a new focus question for Core 2. How does the acquisition of skill affect performance? And we're going to specifically have a look at the stages of skill acquisition today. So if we have a look at where this comes in the syllabus, we know that it comes under the question of how does the acquisition of skill affect performance. And when we have a look at the learnabouts, we look at the stages of skill acquisition. So we're going to be looking at the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage. So when we look at the stages of skill acquisition, there are three distinct stages which can be identified. We have the cognitive, the associative, and the autonomous stage. Now, learners will generally start at the cognitive stage of a skill development and work their way through to associative, and some may then move on to autonomous as they progress and competence improves over time. Before we start having a look at the specific stages and what learners do at each stage, there's a few things that we need to understand. The first one is subroutines. Now, subroutines are the individual components of a movement when sequenced in the correct order and performed at ideal time make a movement look fluid. So, for example, if we have a whole skill and we break it up into small little parts, we call these smaller parts subroutines. So we practice these smaller parts and put them all together as we become better at the skill. The next concept we have to have a look at is relevant cues. Now, relevant cues are a stimulus which could have impact on the outcome of a movement performance. And these types of cues should be considered and applied to performance when needed. So these are obviously cues that are going to improve our performance. And finally, we have a look at the concept of irrelevant cues. So irrelevant cues are a stimulus during movement that will have no impact on the outcome and should be ignored during practice and performance. We usually see these in the earlier stages of skill acquisition. So we start by having a look at the cognitive stage. Now, at the cognitive stage, this is usually that first stage, and we usually have quite a lot of frequent errors and large errors. So the learner will be making lots of mistakes at this stage. And this is where subroutines are established. So if you have a look at the video below, you can see that the learner is trying to break things up into smaller parts so that they can try and decrease the amount of errors that they're having. And they're not quite sure whether they can distinguish between relevant and irrelevant cues. So you can see that the learner down here below in the video is trying to set up cues of ordering things into groups of 3s or 6, but can't quite work that out because of the way the cups are stacking. The next stage of skill acquisition is the associative stage. And at this stage, you've got less frequent errors due to high levels of practice. So an athlete will make less errors and less obvious errors because they're practicing over and over again. When they get to sort of the higher end of the associative stage of skill acquisition, they're able to identify reasons for why they're making errors. Now, most learners will get to the associative stage, and some will never actually progress any further, but just stay at this because they're happy with the level of competency that they're at. And as you can see in the video below, the learner has actually learnt the skill quite well with very few errors. However, the time in which they do this activity is slower than what, say, someone at an autonomous stage would be at. By the time a learner gets to the autonomous stage, occasional errors are identified by the learner. They can understand when they're making mistakes and why they're making mistakes. Those irrelevant cues are generally ignored, and their movements are automatic and consistent. Now, again, it's important to understand that not all learners will progress to the autonomous stage, and some may never even progress beyond the cognitive stage. Things like insufficient quality of practice time, lack of motivation, poor attitude or incorrect instruction or poor feedback are some factors that may influence the level of skill required to get to this autonomous stage. So when summarising the stages of skill acquisition, it's important to remember that we have 3 stages: cognitive, associative, and autonomous. Most people will start at this cognitive stage. Some people will stay in there for quite some time. Others will move straight to the associative once they've had a few goes at a skill, and then move on to the autonomous stage. Most people will actually stay in the associative stage because they're happy with that. It's more when we get to elite athletes or elite learners that will get into the autonomous stage, where things become more automatic and are consistent for the learner or the athlete.